Hidden deep within the forests of the Western Front, a small town became the stage for one of the most overlooked battles of the Second World War, a fight that vanished from the pages of history almost as soon as it ended. What really happened in Velizh, and why did the Soviets later bury its story beneath decades of silence? This is the forgotten front line of the Smolensk campaign, where survival, not victory, defined the true cost of war. In the summer of 1941, the small town of Velizh, situated near the Daugava River in the Smolensk Oblast, found itself caught between the advancing Wehrmacht and the collapsing Red Army. Before the war, Velizh had been an unremarkable administrative center of the Western Oblast, home to roughly 8,000 inhabitants, merchants, craftsmen, and farmers whose lives were soon to be consumed by the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, shattered the fragile peace of the region. Within days, German Army Group Center had crossed the Daugava and was advancing rapidly toward Smolensk, leaving little time for the Soviet Western Front to organize an effective defense. Velizh lay on one of the northern approach routes to Smolensk, making it strategically important despite its small size. It stood between Vitebsk to the west and the Desna River to the east, forming a natural corridor through which both sides sought to maneuver. In early July 1941, as the Wehrmacht's 9th Army and 3rd Panzer Group advanced along the Smolensk axis, the town became a focal point for clashes between German spearheads and Soviet rearguards. German operational planning assigned the sector around Velizh to the LVI Panzer Corps, which sought to outflank Soviet defenses near Polotsk and envelop the Soviet 22nd Army. The Red Army, meanwhile, attempted to transform the forested and marshy terrain into a defensive zone, relying on scattered fortifications and the natural obstacles of rivers and dense woodland. Before the German arrival, the Soviet command's assessment of the situation was already grim. The Western Front, under General Dmitry Pavlov, was in disarray after the encirclements at Minsk and Bialystok. Communications had broken down. Orders arrived late or contradicted one another. The 22nd Army, newly formed and inadequately equipped, was tasked with holding a 200-kilometer front stretching from Vitebsk to Velizh. Many of its formations consisted of militia, reserve divisions, or units hastily withdrawn from Belarus. Their armament was inconsistent. Some battalions lacked heavy machine guns, and artillery pieces were short on ammunition. Soviet records later estimated that on the eve of the German advance, the entire 22nd Army had fewer than 300 operational tanks, many of them obsolete T-26s and BT-7s. The Wehrmacht's preparations, by contrast, reflected the efficiency of a campaign that had yet to encounter serious logistical obstacles. German armored divisions were well supplied, their vehicles freshly serviced and fueled. Air superiority allowed the Luftwaffe to conduct uninterrupted reconnaissance flights, mapping Soviet defensive positions with precision. The LVI Panzer Corps, led by General Erich von Manstein, consisted of 2 armored and 2 motorized divisions, supported by attached artillery and engineering battalions. In total, the Corps fielded around 35,000 men, 600 tanks, and 200 self-propelled and towed guns. Its mission was clear: to break through Soviet positions north of the Daugava and drive southeast toward the Smolensk-Vitebsk highway, effectively cutting the 22nd Army off from the main Soviet defensive network. For the civilian population of Velizh, the rapid collapse of the front was bewildering. Refugees from the western regions streamed through the town, reporting the fall of Polotsk and the burning of Vitebsk. Soviet authorities began evacuating administrative offices and factories, while NKVD detachments executed scorched earth orders, destroying fuel depots, bridges, and communication lines to deny their use to the enemy. Those who remained faced the chaos of overlapping military and civilian movements. Eyewitness accounts describe streets clogged with horse carts, supply trucks, and retreating troops, while German reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead. Within a week, the front line was approaching from the west, and the distant thunder of artillery grew louder each day. By mid-July, Velizh's fate was sealed. The German advance, supported by coordinated air and artillery strikes, overwhelmed the Soviet forward units. The 170th Rifle Division, defending the sector north of the town, reported catastrophic losses after 2 days of combat. Its remnants fell back toward the east bank of the western Dvina River, leaving the town exposed. On July 16, 1941, elements of the 6th Panzer Division entered Velizh after brief resistance. The Red Army's defensive positions had disintegrated. Local commanders ordered surviving units to retreat toward Demidov and Dukovshchina to avoid encirclement. The capture of Velizh provided the Germans with a bridgehead for their continued advance on Smolensk, but the battle for the region was far from over. The Red Army regrouped east of the town, establishing new defensive lines along the Vop and Dnieper rivers. Though Velizh was small, its occupation marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle in the northern sector of the Smolensk campaign, a struggle characterized not by sweeping tank offensives, but by grinding attrition in forests, swamps, and villages. Over the next 2 years, this forgotten sector would witness repeated offensives, counteroffensives, and the slow erosion of German strength as the tide of war began to shift. The conditions in and around Velizh during this period reflected the broader pattern of the Eastern Front, a war of total destruction in which towns changed hands multiple times, and civilians endured occupation, deportation, and mass executions. As the front stabilized in late 1941, Velizh became part of the German defensive line anchored on Vitebsk and Smolensk, manned by elements of the 16th Army. The frontline trench systems extended north toward Nevel and south toward Dukovshchina, forming a semi-permanent scar across the landscape. In this quiet sector, far from the headlines of Moscow or Stalingrad, tens of thousands of soldiers lived and died in obscurity. The coming months would turn Velizh into a microcosm of the forgotten war, where strategy met endurance, and victory was measured in meters rather than kilometers. The capture of Velizh by German forces in mid-July 1941 was only the beginning of the area's transformation into a heavily contested front line. After the fall of Smolensk later that month, the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Soviet territory, yet its momentum began to slow. The initial thrusts that had seemed unstoppable now faced the vastness of Russia, poor roads, and growing resistance. The German Ninth Army was stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, and Velizh, located at the northern edge of its operational zone, became a logistical anchor point. Engineers constructed bridges and depots along the Daugava, and rebuilt parts of the road network to sustain the offensive toward Demidov and Toropets. Meanwhile, remnants of Soviet units retreating east of Velizh regrouped under the newly appointed commander of the Western Front, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko. The Red Army was reassembling from chaos, using the breathing space bought by desperate delaying actions. Reinforcements were arriving from the Urals and Siberia, forming new rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments. Among them was the 243rd Rifle Division, created in the Smolensk region in late July 1941 and soon deployed near Velizh. These troops were poorly equipped, often lacking uniforms or modern rifles, but their arrival signaled the Soviet intention to resist and, when possible, counterattack. The first Soviet counteroffensive near Velizh began in early August. Soviet intelligence believed that the German garrison, composed primarily of logistical and engineering units, was vulnerable. Supported by the 29th Army to the north and the 30th Army to the south, Soviet forces launched probing attacks across the Daugava. However, these operations encountered strong German defenses, including entrenched infantry supported by artillery and air reconnaissance. The LVI Panzer Corps, though partially redeployed, maintained mobile reserves capable of rapid response. German reports indicate that Soviet forces suffered heavy casualties during these early assaults, up to 4,000 men in less than a week of fighting, with minimal territorial gain. Velizh's occupation brought profound changes to its population. German military administration quickly imposed order through a combination of strict regulations and ruthless repression. The town's Jewish community, which had numbered over 1,000 before the war, was subjected to mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen units in August 1941. Surviving residents were forced into labor battalions, rebuilding roads and fortifications under harsh conditions. The local police, under German supervision, assisted in maintaining control, while partisans began forming in the forests to the east. This dual reality, a militarized occupation in the town and a growing insurgency in the countryside, defined life in the Velizh sector through 1942. For the Wehrmacht, maintaining control of Velizh was crucial to securing the flank of Army Group Center's northern defenses. As German forces advanced toward Moscow, the Smolensk region served as a key supply corridor. Velizh's position between Vitebsk and Demidov allowed it to host communication nodes and repair workshops. The 252nd Infantry Division was assigned to hold the area, fortifying defensive positions along the river lines and constructing field fortifications on the approaches to the town. The Germans transformed Velizh into a forward supply base, complete with ammunition dumps, fuel storage, and a small airfield used for reconnaissance planes. The Red Army's leadership, however, saw Velizh not merely as a tactical position, but as part of the broader effort to stabilize the Smolensk front and prepare for a future counteroffensive. In late 1941, after the failure of Operation Typhoon and the German retreat from the gates of Moscow, Soviet forces launched a general winter offensive. Velizh once again became a target. The 39th Army, operating in coordination with the Kalinin Front, advanced toward the town, aiming to disrupt German supply lines and potentially encircle enemy formations near Vitebsk. The fighting in the winter of 1941-1942 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below 30 degrees Celsius, immobilizing vehicles and freezing weapons. Both sides suffered from supply shortages and inadequate shelter. Soviet troops, often advancing on foot through waist-deep snow, attacked German positions with limited artillery support. German divisions, though entrenched, faced exhaustion and frostbite on a massive scale. Diaries from German soldiers stationed near Velizh describe the constant strain of holding positions under relentless night raids and partisan ambushes. By February 1942, Soviet forces had succeeded in establishing bridgeheads on the western bank of the Daugava near Velizh, but they were unable to retake the town itself. German counterattacks using assault guns and mortars drove them back across the river. The front lines stabilized once more, with both sides entrenched in a static war of attrition. The surrounding forests became a no-man's land, patrolled by partisans and reconnaissance groups. The civilian population, already decimated, faced famine and disease. Food supplies were requisitioned by both armies, and entire villages were burned during anti-partisan operations. Through 1942, Velizh remained a quiet but strategically vital position. The German command viewed it as a hinge point between the northern and central sectors of the Eastern Front. The town's airfield was expanded, serving as a base for liaison aircraft and supply drops to isolated units. Soviet command, meanwhile, monitored the area closely, preparing new offensives aimed at breaking the German front. The balance of power had shifted. No longer could the Wehrmacht advance freely. The tide of the war was beginning to turn, even if the soldiers in the trenches of Velizh could not yet see it. The period between late 1941 and early 1943 would transform Velizh from a frontline outpost into a symbol of endurance. Its defenders and attackers, trapped in the cyclical rhythm of attack and counterattack, endured unimaginable hardship for ground measured in meters. The front, frozen both literally and strategically, became a silent witness to the broader stalemate of the Eastern Front, one that would only break when the Soviet armies launched their massive counteroffensives later in 1943. By early 1943, the balance of forces along the Velizh sector had changed dramatically. The Wehrmacht, still entrenched in the forests and along the river lines, was no longer the unstoppable force it had been in 1941. Losses on other fronts, particularly at Stalingrad and in the Rzhev salient, had drained its strength and morale. Army Group Center, to which the German divisions around Velizh belonged, was under increasing pressure to hold vast territories with diminishing manpower. Reinforcements arrived sporadically, and fuel shortages forced commanders to limit armored and motorized patrols. The once efficient supply lines that connected Velizh to Vitebsk and Smolensk had become vulnerable to air raids and partisan sabotage. The German High Command recognized the growing instability of the northern flank. The 252nd Infantry Division, which had held Velizh since 1941, was reinforced with elements of the 206th Infantry Division and additional anti-tank detachments. Defensive positions were expanded into a multi-layered system of trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Engineers constructed concrete pillboxes along the main roads leading to Demidov and Nevel. Despite these fortifications, German soldiers were aware that the front could no longer be sustained indefinitely. The Red Army's strength was rebuilding at an alarming pace. Soviet intelligence flights over the area increased, and reports of troop movements near Bely and Dukovshchina suggested that a new offensive was imminent. On the Soviet side, preparations for a renewed campaign began in the late winter of 1943. The Kalinin Front, under General Andrei Yeryomenko, identified Velizh as a key point in the German defensive network north of Smolensk. Its capture would open the way toward Vitebsk and threaten the German rear. The 39th Army, supported by the 43rd Army to the south, assembled artillery, mortars, and tanks in the forests east of the Daugava. Soviet command intended to exploit weaknesses in the German lines by combining frontal assaults with deep raids from partisan units operating behind enemy lines. By this time, partisan forces in the Smolensk region numbered over 25,000 fighters organized into brigades. Their operations disrupted rail transport, cut telephone lines, and attacked German convoys, actions that gradually eroded the Wehrmacht's control of the area. In March 1943, the Soviet offensive began with intense artillery bombardments. The Red Army deployed massed Katyusha rocket batteries to soften German positions. Entire sections of the front were engulfed in fire and smoke as shells tore through bunkers and trenches. Infantry followed under cover of fog and snow, advancing in small assault groups armed with grenades and submachine guns. The first wave made limited progress. German defenders counterattacked with automatic fire and local reserves. However, Soviet persistence paid off. By mid-March, Soviet troops had crossed the Daugava north of Velizh, establishing footholds that threatened to encircle parts of the 252nd Division. German countermeasures were swift but costly. Mobile reserves, including assault guns from Sturmgeschütz Battalion 185, launched repeated counterattacks to restore the line. These engagements were brutal, often fought at point-blank range in forests where visibility was measured in meters. German after-action reports recorded heavy casualties, some battalions reduced to fewer than 200 men. Still, the defenders managed to hold Velizh itself, though the town was now under constant shelling. For the civilians who remained, survival was a daily ordeal. The once bustling marketplace was reduced to rubble. Houses were burned or abandoned. Food was scarce, and disease spread through makeshift shelters. German occupation authorities, fearing infiltration by partisans, conducted mass deportations of suspected collaborators. Soviet leaflets, dropped by aircraft, urged the population to flee east or join the resistance. Between the bombardments and reprisals, many chose to hide in the surrounding forests, where partisan detachments provided some measure of protection. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, the front line near Velizh remained fluid. Each side launched attacks that gained little but cost much. The German army, constrained by Hitler's order to hold every position, refused to withdraw even when encirclement loomed. Soviet commanders, for their part, faced logistical limitations and were forced to pause repeated offensives to rebuild strength. The struggle around Velizh mirrored the broader pattern of the Eastern Front that year, a grinding contest of endurance that slowly tilted in the Soviets' favor. By August 1943, the Red Army's successes at Kursk and Orel began to reshape the strategic picture. German High Command ordered limited withdrawals from secondary sectors to reinforce the collapsing front to the south. For the first time, signs of weakening discipline appeared among the troops stationed near Velizh. Desertion cases increased, and local commanders reported shortages of ammunition and fuel. The Luftwaffe's presence had diminished. Soviet aircraft now flew over the town with relative impunity. In September, Soviet reconnaissance units detected signs that German forces were preparing fallback positions west of Velizh. The Red Army Command saw an opportunity. The 39th Army intensified its artillery preparation, concentrating fire on bridges and crossroads to isolate the town. Partisan groups coordinated with frontline troops, cutting off retreat routes and ambushing convoys. By mid-September, the German positions around Velizh were collapsing under pressure from three directions. The once stable northern flank of Army Group Center was unraveling, and Velizh, after 2 years of continuous combat, was on the verge of liberation. The final battles for the town would not come swiftly. The German command, despite overwhelming odds, sought to delay the Soviet advance long enough to secure an orderly withdrawal toward Vitebsk. The next phase of the fighting would decide not only the fate of Velizh, but also the stability of the entire Smolensk defensive sector. The Soviet offensive to recapture Velizh began in earnest in early October 1943 as part of the broader Smolensk operation that had already liberated cities such as Yelnya, Roslavel, and Demidov. For the Red Army, Velizh represented not just a tactical objective but a symbolic victory, one of the last German strongholds still anchoring the northern shoulder of Army Group Center. The offensive was spearheaded by the 39th Army under Lieutenant General Alexander Zygin, with support from the 43rd Army to the south and several partisan brigades coordinating in the forests west of the town. Before the assault, Soviet artillery units unleashed a concentrated barrage lasting over 2 hours. Thousands of shells pounded German defenses, flattening trenches, cutting wire obstacles, and setting ammunition dumps ablaze. The goal was not only to destroy fortifications, but to shatter morale among defenders who had endured 2 years of unbroken hardship. As soon as the bombardment lifted, Soviet infantry advanced in waves, supported by tanks of the 5th Tank Corps and sappers clearing minefields. The terrain around Velizh, dense woodland, swampy riverbanks, and ruined villages, made coordination difficult. But Soviet command had learned from earlier failures. Air reconnaissance guided the attack, and radio units ensured constant communication between divisions. German defenders, primarily elements of the 252nd Infantry Division and remnants of the 206th Division, resisted fiercely. Despite shortages of ammunition and artillery, they used their well-prepared defenses to inflict heavy casualties on the attackers. Snipers positioned in church towers and factory ruins delayed Soviet advances, while mortars and machine guns swept open fields. Yet, for all their determination, the Germans were fighting a hopeless battle. The last functioning radio transmitter in the town went silent by midday on October 7th. When the Red Army finally secured Velizh on October 8, 1943, the scene was one of devastation. Only a few dozen buildings remained intact, the rest had been reduced to rubble or burned. German resistance had been annihilated, some 3,000 soldiers killed, 200 captured, and several hundred more retreating west through the forests. Soviet losses were also severe, estimated at around 5,000 dead and wounded, reflecting the ferocity of the battle despite its local scale. But strategically, the operation was a success. The fall of Velizh opened a 60-kilometer gap in the German defensive line, forcing Army Group Center to withdraw toward Vitebsk and Nevel to avoid encirclement. In the aftermath of liberation, the Soviet authorities immediately began restoring communications and organizing medical aid for the wounded. Field reports from October 1943 reveal growing despair within the German ranks. Equipment losses were unrecoverable, replacements were scarce, and morale was collapsing. Officers described the retreat through the Velizh region as disorderly and exhausted. The Luftwaffe, unable to maintain air superiority, struggled to provide even minimal reconnaissance support. As the front moved west, Velizh was left behind as a shattered ruin. Its fields were littered with wrecks of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. The once quiet Daugava Valley, a place of small farms and wooden churches, had become an open graveyard. Yet amid the destruction, reconstruction began almost immediately. Soviet engineers repaired roads, while local survivors returned to rebuild their homes from the ruins. For them, the war was not over, but the worst. The years of occupation, fear, and massacre had ended. By the end of 1943, Velizh had ceased to be a frontline town. The war rolled further west, leaving behind a landscape scarred by 2 years of continuous combat. The strategic lessons drawn from the battle would influence Soviet tactics in later operations, lessons about coordination, logistics, and the value of combining partisan warfare with conventional offensives. The forgotten battle for Velizh had finally ended, but its memory would linger as one of the many unrecorded struggles that shaped the fate of the Eastern Front. After the liberation of Velizh in October 1943, the Smolensk campaign entered a new and complex phase. The Soviet command's immediate objective was to exploit the momentum gained by the fall of the town and press deeper into northern Belarus, targeting Vitebsk and the approaches to Polotsk. However, despite the dramatic breakthrough at Velizh, the German Army Group Center was not yet defeated. Soviet aviation, now increasingly dominant in the air, played a vital role in reconnaissance and interdiction of German transport routes. At the same time, German command recognized the symbolic and strategic danger posed by Soviet gains in the Velizh sector. To prevent a complete collapse of the northern wing of Army Group Center, the Wehrmacht initiated a counter-consolidation operation in November 1943. The remnants of the 252nd and 206th Infantry Divisions, supported by the 14th Motorized Division, and elements of the 6th Luftwaffe Field Division, dug in west of Velizh. These troops constructed new defensive lines, trenches, barbed wire fields, and anti-tank ditches, supported by artillery concentrations near Nevel and Gorodok. Although their numbers were thin, they benefited from well-prepared terrain and experience in defensive warfare. Soviet reconnaissance detected these movements early. By mid-November, reports indicated a significant buildup of German reserves around Gorodok, suggesting preparations for either a counterattack or a new defensive stand. Stalin's Stavka ordered continued pressure to prevent German forces from regrouping. The 39th Army launched a series of limited offensives in the second half of the month, supported by units of the 4th Shock Army operating north of the Daugava. These actions aimed to secure river crossings and disrupt German logistics rather than achieve deep territorial gains. The fighting was bitter and costly, characterized by freezing temperatures, muddy terrain, and relentless artillery duels. The German counteroffensive that followed in December 1943 was one of the last tactical successes of Army Group Center before its eventual collapse in 1944. Exploiting overstretched Soviet lines and gaps between divisions, the Germans attacked near the village of Verkhnaya Dvina, pushing Soviet forces back several kilometers. For a brief period, German troops even threatened the outskirts of Velizh, shelling the town's eastern districts. However, Soviet reinforcements, particularly tank units from the 5th Mechanized Corps, quickly countered the advance. After a week of heavy fighting, the German thrust was blunted. Casualty reports from both sides indicate that over 10,000 men were lost in this localized struggle, reflecting the continued ferocity of combat even after major offensives had ceased. The winter of 1943-1944 was one of consolidation. For the Red Army, Velizh became a logistical hub rather than a combat zone. Military engineers constructed new depots, field hospitals, and ammunition warehouses. Soviet war correspondents visiting the town described scenes of ruin mixed with reconstruction, villagers clearing debris, columns of supply trucks rumbling westward, and trains unloading replacement tanks and artillery pieces. The 39th Army's headquarters occupied a partially rebuilt structure near the town square, where Soviet officers coordinated reconnaissance and supply operations. Civilians returning to the area were put to work rebuilding bridges, repairing roads, and salvaging usable materials from the debris. The Soviet authorities organized sabotniks, voluntary labor days, during which both soldiers and locals cleared rubble and laid communication lines. Although the scars of war were everywhere, the air carried a sense of inevitability. Soldiers passing through Velizh knew they were moving towards something decisive. Rumors spread of a massive summer offensive that would finally destroy the German front once and for all. In May 1944, preparations for that offensive accelerated. The First Baltic Front, commanded by General Bagramian, and the Third Belarusian Front under General Chernyakhovsky, finalized operational plans that would soon merge into what would be known as Operation Bagration. German prisoners captured near Neville spoke of dwindling morale and shortages so severe that frontline soldiers often received only half rations. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a fraction of its former strength, made sporadic bombing runs on Velizh, but Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, now reinforced by 37mm guns, prevented significant damage. The skies that had once belonged to the Germans now belonged firmly to the Red Air Force. By June 1944, as the offensive neared, Velizh stood at the heart of one of the largest logistical operations of the war. Columns of tanks and self-propelled artillery stretched for kilometers, camouflaged beneath forest canopies. Thousands of tons of shells and fuel were stacked in warehouses marked only by red flags and warning signs. The Soviet command had learned from earlier campaigns. This time supply chains would not break under pressure. For Velizh, the change was profound. The town that had been a supply base in the spring now stood behind the front by nearly 200 kilometers, serving as a vast rear logistics hub for the advancing Red Army. The Soviet machine was moving at an unprecedented pace. Entire armies were crossing Belarus, cutting German retreat routes, and liberating cities like Minsk and Vilnius. Yet for all the celebration at the front, the rear areas like Velizh bore the quieter, grimmer burden of sustaining this momentum. The Soviet logistical system in 1944 was a masterpiece of coordination born from years of hardship. In Velizh, supply trains arrived day and night from Smolensk and Rezhev, unloading thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, and food. Makeshift depots filled with crates of small arms cartridges, shells, and spare tank parts stretched along the repaired rail yards. From these stockpiles, motorized columns carried supplies to forward railheads closer to the front. Military engineers worked tirelessly to keep roads passable, laying corduroy surfaces over swampy stretches and rebuilding destroyed bridges. The sheer scale of movement was staggering. Tens of thousands of tons of materiel flowed through Velizh each week, feeding the Soviet advance into the Baltic states and eastern Poland. While soldiers moved west, Velizh began to witness the slow return of civilians. Those who had fled or been deported during the occupation trickled back, searching for family and remnants of their former homes. Many found only ruins. Soviet authorities initiated a reconstruction program under the State Committee for the Restoration of Liberated Territories. By the end of 1944, rudimentary housing was rebuilt, and a sawmill and brickworks resumed operation under military supervision. The new administration sought to restore not only infrastructure, but morale. Local newspapers printed in makeshift offices published reports on Soviet victories and encouraged citizens to contribute to the war effort through labor and resource collection. Every recovered village was expected to provide timber, scrap metal, or food to the army. The front might have moved west, but its demands remained omnipresent. The NKVD maintained a firm presence in Velizh, ensuring political control and investigating remnants of German collaboration. Files from post-war Soviet archives describe dozens of cases where civilians were accused of aiding the occupiers or denouncing partisans. Some were sentenced to labor camps, others were executed. The purges extended beyond individuals. Entire families were relocated if deemed politically unreliable. At the same time, the Soviet state honored those who had resisted. Partisan commanders from the Velizh forests were awarded medals and integrated into the local administration. Their wartime experience made them valuable assets in the reconstruction effort, especially in restoring transportation and communications. Militarily, Velizh's strategic role evolved again as the Red Army advanced toward East Prussia and the Baltic coast. In the autumn of 1944, as operations shifted to the borders of Germany itself, Velizh became part of a secondary supply corridor supporting the First Baltic Front's thrust toward Königsberg and Memel. New rail spurs connected it to Polotsk and Vitebsk, and convoys of medical trains began transporting the wounded back from the front. The town's hospitals, many of them hastily expanded, treated soldiers suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, and shrapnel injuries. Doctors and nurses, often working 20-hour shifts, faced shortages of everything from bandages to morphine. Despite these conditions, survival rates were improving, a testament to the growing professionalism of Soviet field medicine. By this stage of the war, the German military was in full retreat, but pockets of resistance continued to operate behind the front lines. Small German sabotage groups, some composed of former Wehrmacht or SS personnel, infiltrated Soviet-controlled areas to destroy bridges or ambush convoys. The Velizh sector saw several such incidents in late 1944, prompting increased patrols and curfews. Soviet counterintelligence recorded multiple arrests of suspected saboteurs, some of whom carried false identity papers issued by German intelligence units operating out of East Prussia. Although these acts failed to seriously disrupt logistics, they added to the pervasive atmosphere of tension and vigilance that defined the rear zones of the Soviet advance. The local population endured extraordinary hardship even as victory approached. Food remained scarce, with rations distributed primarily to soldiers and essential workers. Winter 1944-45 was particularly harsh. Fuel shortages forced people to burn furniture and debris for warmth. Yet amid the deprivation, there was an unshakable sense that the end of the war was near. For the first time in years, Soviet broadcasts spoke not of survival, but of triumph. The enemy was being driven back to his own borders. When news of the liberation of Warsaw and the crossing of the Vistula reached Velizh in January 1945, church bells rang for the first time since before the occupation. At the same time, Soviet authorities began to confront the immense human and material losses that Velizh had suffered since 1941. Official reports estimated that over 80% of the town's infrastructure had been destroyed. Pre-war industry, including small textile workshops, mills, and tanneries, had been obliterated. More tragically, the population had been decimated. Of the roughly 8,000 inhabitants recorded in 1939, fewer than 2,000 remained by 1945. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Soviet census officials documented hundreds of families with no surviving members. In one haunting entry, investigators noted a street where only one child survived out of 50 residents recorded before the war. By the spring of 1945, as Berlin fell, Velizh was beginning to rebuild in earnest. The front had moved far west into Germany, and the town's purpose as a logistical hub was waning. Yet soldiers continued to pass through, veterans of the war's final battles who stopped briefly before demobilization or reassignment. They left graffiti on the walls, names, unit numbers, and dates, inscriptions that would remain for decades as silent memorials. When the victory announcement came on May 9, 1945, Velizh celebrated quietly. There were no parades, no fireworks. The town's few remaining citizens gathered in the square amid the ruins of their homes, listening to the radio broadcast from Moscow. For them, the war's end brought not jubilation, but relief, a release from years of terror, hunger, and uncertainty. Velizh's role in the Smolensk campaign and its aftermath faded from public memory as larger battles claimed the historical spotlight. Yet for those who lived through it, the name Velizh symbolized endurance, a small, obscure town that had stood on the fault line of Europe's greatest conflict, witnessing its devastation and its redemption. As Soviet troops marched westward to victory, Velizh remained behind as one of countless forgotten places whose suffering made that victory possible. Its story was not one of glory, but of survival, a victory of endurance, reconstruction, and the quiet strength of those who refused to disappear. In the summer of 1945, the guns fell silent across Europe, but for Velizh and the surrounding regions, peace did not bring an immediate sense of normalcy. The town lay in ruins, and though the war had moved far beyond its horizon, the echoes of destruction still defined everyday life. Soviet authorities faced an enormous task: to rebuild not only the physical landscape, but also the social fabric shattered by 4 years of occupation and total war. Velizh became part of a broader Soviet effort to re-establish administrative control and integrate the liberated Western territories into the post-war order. The first challenge was survival. Food remained scarce, and the returning population depended heavily on state rations. Agricultural production had collapsed. Most livestock had been requisitioned or slaughtered by the retreating Germans, and the fields were littered with mines and wreckage. Soviet sappers worked through the summer months to clear the surrounding countryside, often at the cost of their lives. Mines were found in wells, barns, and even beneath household stoves, grim remnants of the occupation. Only by late 1946 did farming resume at a meaningful scale, with collective farms re-established under strict party supervision. Grain and potatoes became the foundation of recovery, and the government offered small rewards to peasants who exceeded quotas, though shortages remained endemic. The NKVD, soon reorganized as the MGB, retained a strong presence in Velizh during these years. Their mission extended beyond security. They oversaw political re-education, the collection of war crimes evidence, and the tracking of former collaborators. Trials were held in the district center, often in makeshift courtrooms housed within damaged administrative buildings. Witnesses testified about deportations, executions, and the systematic burning of villages. The Extraordinary State Commission's reports from the region estimated that more than 10,000 civilians had been killed during the German occupation, including entire Jewish families who had been executed near the town's outskirts in 1942. Mass graves were uncovered and documented, later forming part of the Soviet case presented at the Nuremberg trials. For survivors, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Many families had lost not only relatives, but their entire sense of belonging. In the years immediately following the war, Velizh became a transient place, a stopover for displaced persons returning from forced labor in Germany, for demobilized soldiers seeking their villages, and for orphans placed under state care. Schools reopened, though with little more than salvaged furniture and handwritten textbooks. Teachers, many of them war widows, struggled to restore basic education. In 1946, a small cultural club was founded, serving as both library and community hall. It hosted lectures on Marxist ideology, but also music evenings, poetry readings, and film screenings. Soviet propaganda and genuine human need for connection overlapped here, rebuilding identity through controlled memory. Economically, the revival was slow but deliberate. The state prioritized reconstruction of transport and communications infrastructure, knowing that control over mobility was essential to post-war stability. In 1947, the railway connection between Velizh and Smolensk was restored, allowing goods and passengers to move again. Timber became the region's primary export. Forests that had served as partisan hideouts during the war were now harvested under state direction. Logging brigades, staffed partly by German prisoners of war, worked year-round to meet reconstruction demands. The wood processed in Velizh's sawmills helped rebuild towns across western Russia and Belarus. At the same time, small-scale industry re-emerged: brick production, a flour mill, and a modest textile workshop, employing mostly women. Amid the reconstruction, new social dynamics emerged. The war had erased much of the pre-1941 social hierarchy, replacing it with a generation forged by survival. Veterans returning from the front assumed leadership roles in the local administration and Communist Party. Their authority derived not from education or lineage, but from the moral capital of wartime service. The state actively promoted this new elite through awards, housing privileges, and positions within the Komsomol and local Soviets. Yet the scars of the war remained visible in every aspect of daily life. Nearly every family had lost someone, and the population imbalance between men and women was severe. Many households were headed by widows or elderly parents caring for orphans. In cultural terms, Velizh entered a phase of cautious remembrance. Official monuments were erected, simple obelisks engraved with the Red Star, to honor soldiers who died liberating the town. Annual commemorations were held on Victory Day, though the focus was collective rather than personal. Soviet historiography emphasized the heroism of the Red Army and the unity of the people, leaving little room for local or individual suffering. The stories of Jewish victims, partisans, and civilian executions were mentioned only briefly in official publications, subordinated to the broader narrative of Soviet victory. Nonetheless, privately, survivors shared their memories, passing them through families and informal gatherings. Memory in this period became an act of quiet resistance against oblivion. Politically, the region was reabsorbed into the Smolensk Oblast administrative structure, and Velizh functioned as a district center. Local governance was tightly controlled by Moscow, with strict adherence to Stalinist policies. Agricultural collectivization was intensified, and new quotas were imposed on farmers who had only recently rebuilt their livelihoods. In 1948-49, the last remnants of the pre-war private economy were dismantled. The late 1940s also brought the tightening grip of the early Cold War. Western influence was denounced, and the town's newspaper printed articles warning against imperialist provocations. Propaganda urged citizens to remain vigilant against spies and bourgeois ideology. Still, even under this rigid control, life began to stabilize. By 1950, Velizh's population exceeded 4,000, still half its pre-war number, but enough to sustain a functioning community. Children attended school, markets reopened, and electricity returned to most homes. The sounds of reconstruction replaced those of artillery. Soviet films depicting heroism and sacrifice filled the cinema hall, reinforcing the idea that Velizh's suffering had been part of a grand historical purpose. Few questioned this narrative publicly, though the silence surrounding personal loss lingered in every household. In the broader context of Soviet post-war recovery, Velizh was one of thousands of small towns that exemplified both the resilience and the contradictions of reconstruction. It stood as a place of endurance, where survival was not celebrated, but simply assumed, a duty fulfilled. The war had passed, but its shadow remained in the cracked walls, the unmarked graves, and the generations who carried its memory quietly forward. Velizh had once been a forgotten front in a vast campaign. Now it was a forgotten corner of victory, a silent witness to the price of history's advance. By the early 1950s, Velizh had regained a semblance of stability, but beneath the surface lay the invisible consequences of war and occupation, scars that could not be erased by propaganda or reconstruction. The Soviet Union was entering a new era, the age of nuclear rivalry, industrial expansion, and ideological conformity. For small towns like Velizh, these global shifts translated into rigid bureaucracy, political surveillance, and the slow transformation of memory into official myth. The war, though only a few years past, was being rewritten in documents and speeches. Its complexity, the chaos, the loss, the moral ambiguity, was replaced by a monolithic story of victory and heroism. In Velizh, this process was particularly visible. The district committee of the Communist Party issued regular directives on how the war should be commemorated. Local schools taught a standardized version of the Great Patriotic War, emphasizing the triumph of the Soviet system and the leadership of Stalin. Veterans were invited to speak to students, but only within the limits of approved narratives. Stories that deviated, those about the purges, the executions of suspected collaborators, or the brutal reprisals during the liberation, were quietly discouraged. Teachers and writers who attempted to describe the war as they had lived it risked accusations of defeatism or distortion of historical truth. The town's physical recovery continued, though at a slower pace. State investment was directed toward rebuilding industrial centers in large cities. Smaller districts like Velizh relied heavily on local initiative. The sawmill remained the main employer, along with collective farms that surrounded the town. Production quotas were strict, and failure to meet them was often treated as a political offense rather than an economic one. Workers' meetings were held weekly, where party officials reminded everyone that rebuilding was not merely a task. It was a patriotic duty. Posters adorned the factory walls, images of strong, smiling laborers and slogans proclaiming, Our work is the continuation of victory. The gap between propaganda and reality grew wider each year. Life was still marked by austerity. Most homes lacked running water, and heating came from wood stoves fueled by scraps from the sawmill. Electricity was intermittent, often failing during the long winter nights. Food remained rationed well into the post-war decade, and only by 1953 were free markets fully restored. The population hovered around 5,000, a fragile community sustained by endurance rather than prosperity. Yet amid these hardships, signs of cultural revival appeared. The reopened school expanded to 10 grades, a public library stocked with Moscow-published books, and a local museum began collecting wartime relics, rusted helmets, medals, fragments of artillery shells. These objects, displayed in glass cases, became the foundation of Velizh's new identity, a museum town of survival and victory. The memory of the Jewish community, once integral to Velizh's life, was notably absent from these exhibits. Before the war, Jews had comprised nearly half the town's population, with their own schools, synagogues, and craftsmen's guilds. By 1945, almost none had survived. Soviet authorities commemorated their deaths under the generalized label of Soviet citizens executed by the fascists. No separate memorials were permitted, and religious revival was suppressed. The silence surrounding this loss became one of the most enduring voids in the town's history, a gap in the narrative that would remain unspoken until decades later. Politically, the Stalinist state maintained an atmosphere of vigilance and fear. In 1949, a new wave of purges swept through local administrations across Western Russia. In Velizh, several officials and teachers were dismissed or arrested on charges of anti-Soviet agitation. Some were accused of praising the West or spreading defeatist rumors. The arrests sent ripples through the small community, reminding residents that even peace could be dangerous. It was about endurance, a quiet, stubborn refusal to vanish into the vast machinery of war and history. The post-war years had turned the once strategic Frontline town into a symbol of anonymity, one of thousands of places that had carried the immense weight of the war without ever entering the textbooks. Yet that anonymity was itself a legacy, a reminder that history is not only written in great battles and declarations, but also in the silence of small towns like Velizh, where survival itself was victory enough. By the late 1950s, Velizh had fully transitioned from a wartime outpost into a quiet provincial town. The echoes of artillery and the chaos of occupation were gone, replaced by the rhythm of reconstruction and the controlled optimism of the Soviet post-war years. Yet beneath this new calm lingered the weight of what had been lost. The war had not only destroyed the physical landscape, it had also fractured memory, identity, and continuity. For Velizh, as for countless other towns along the Smolensk front, the post-war decades became a long process of forgetting and selective remembrance, shaped by the needs of the Soviet state and the survival instincts of its people. The town's identity became anchored in official narratives of heroism. In 1959, a district museum of military glory was opened, displaying uniforms, medals, and weapons recovered from the surrounding forests. Soviet historians visited to document the heroic resistance of the Red Army in the Velizh sector. Their publications, though factually accurate in military terms, carefully avoided the darker realities, the executions of civilians, the starvation during occupation, and the post-liberation purges. The memory of Velizh's Jewish community, erased during the war, remained unacknowledged. Official records referred only to peaceful Soviet citizens killed by the invaders. Silence became the defining feature of remembrance. Silence shaped by fear, conformity, and the desire to move forward. Generational change deepened this divide between lived memory and official history. By the 1960s, a new generation was growing up with no direct experience of the war. To them, the ruins were gone, replaced by brick houses, paved roads, and schools that taught sanitized versions of the past. The stories their grandparents told, whispered tales of hunger, terror, and partisans, clashed with the state-approved textbooks that celebrated glorious offensives and the triumph of socialism. Commemoration was institutionalized, parades on Victory Day, wreaths at the monument, and patriotic oaths in classrooms. The personal tragedy of Velizh was absorbed into the larger narrative of national triumph. Still, fragments of the real story persisted, preserved in memory and in the landscape itself. Outside town, along the Daugava, lay the remnants of trenches and dugouts where soldiers had fought and died. Local farmers occasionally uncovered mass graves, which were quietly reported to the authorities and reburied under official supervision. These discoveries reminded everyone that the ground beneath them was not ordinary soil. It was the layered archive of war, soaked in history that the living rarely dared to speak aloud. A few veterans who had returned to settle in Velizh gathered informally each year, sharing their experiences over tea and vodka. Their stories did not appear in print, but they formed a parallel history, one of endurance rather than victory. In the broader Soviet context, the Velizh region remained peripheral. Industrialization bypassed it, focusing instead on larger cities like Smolensk and Vitebsk. The local economy centered on timber and agriculture, with small factories producing bricks, furniture, and processed wood. Life was modest but stable. Every unmarked grave, every family photo rescued from the ruins, every rusted relic pulled from the soil speaks to a truth larger than victory or defeat, the truth of endurance. Velizh's history is not one of grand heroism or decisive battles. It is the story of a small town that lived through the full spectrum of the 20th century's brutality and survived long enough to remember. In the end, that endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, and profoundly human, is Velizh's greatest legacy. It reminds us that history's grand narratives are built upon places like this: forgotten towns, anonymous faces, unrecorded lives. And though the world may never again speak the name Velizh, the ground beneath it still holds the memory of everything that passed: the fear, the courage, the silence, and the fragile persistence of life itself.